Hello, everybody. My name's Will McMahon, and I'd like to welcome you to our roundtable and our participants to the roundtable, those of you watching on YouTube and Facebook live to this event, which we've titled, What are the Consequences of the Growth of Short-Term Lets in Bristol? Perspectives from Manchester, Europe and New York. My name's Will McMahon. I'll be facilitating the event on behalf of Action on Empty Homes. The event will last for no longer than an hour and a half. The idea is that we get a burst of information from our experts and then we take questions from the public and from others at the round table. We will be taking your questions on Facebook and YouTube. So if you want to put them in there, we'll be collecting them together. My job is basically to nudge the conversation along. And that's what I'll try and do. I'll try and say as little as possible. So just before we kick off, I need to point you in the direction of an in-person public meeting on this issue that's being held in Bristol on Monday, 3rd of October from 6:30 to 8 p.m. at Bristol Central Friends Meeting House in Champion Square. If you can make it and you're from Bristol, it'd be great to see you there. Now, what we've done is we've asked our speakers to keep their contributions briefish, 10 minutes or so, because we also want to hear from them during the roundtable discussion. And we hope that this will make for a much more informative event. I'm going to ask everybody at the round table to introduce themselves now. So when I call your name out, just say who you are, and then I'll pass the virtual microphone to Luke. So Chris, can you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Chris Bailey from Action on Empty Homes, and I'm the National Campaign Manager.
And Mehmet?
Hi everyone, I'm Mehmet Jansoy. I'm an assistant professor of sociology at Fairfield University in Connecticut in the USA.
Matty?
Hi, I'm Matty Edwards. I'm a journalist at the Bristol Cable, 100% reader-owned media cooperative in the city. We've been looking at short-term lets earlier this year.
And Murray?
Hi there. My name's Murray Cox. I'm the founder of a data activist project inside Airbnb, which has been collecting Airbnb data since 2015, and I advocate for appropriate regulations as well.
And Claire?
Hello, my name is Claire Collum. I'm a professor of urban studies and planning at the Bartlett School of Planning, working on the issue of the regulation of short-term rentals.
Okay, so I'm going to now hand over to Luke to do our first introduction, and I'll just add your slides to the screen, Luke. Yep. Over to you.
Thanks, Will, and thanks to everyone involved for putting together this event. So my name's Luke Yates. I'm a lecturer in sociology and researcher in the Sustainable Consumption Institute at the University of Manchester. Mainly, I'll be talking about my experience of studying Airbnb in Manchester, alongside some members of residents groups and tenants unions. And I'm hoping there'll be some parallels or insights from telling this story with people who are trying to understand what's been happening in Bristol too. So one element of my work for 2 or 3 years has been looking at the politics of platforms like Airbnb. And I came to this interested in the ways that Silicon Valley platforms are changing our cities in different ways, and the way that we do short-term accommodation, and trying to understand the nature of that change and the positive and the negative implications of it. As people here know, there are several controversies around Airbnb, including taxation, discrimination, noise, impact on neighbours. Perhaps the most significant of these is housing, though. That's because growth in numbers of Airbnbs have been linked to gentrification in a large number of cities. And my work and Claire's work as well actually looks at the ways in which these companies have reacted to attempts to regulate them by cities or national governments. And on this topic, I published a report last year on how Airbnb and other companies mobilize their users and allies to put pressure on governments and cities who are trying to regulate them. In Airbnb's case, that has meant hiring hundreds of community organizers to set up front groups in cities worldwide. those groups were trained and resourced to advocate for lighter regulation. And there's a link to the report with the URL there. And the other element of my interest in Airbnb, and what I'll mainly talk about now, has been working in collaboration with other academics, some residents groups, and the Greater Manchester Tenants Union to try and understand the way that Airbnb is affecting the city that I live in, Manchester. So we produced a report together that was published last year. Another URL there if people want to sort of directly read along with me. The elements that I'll cover here are what kind of a thing is Airbnb in Manchester? So I want to sort of try and characterize it. I want to say something about what we thought Airbnb might be a few years ago, this idea of the sharing economy narrative and spare rooms. I'll talk a little bit about how Airbnb has evolved over time in Manchester. So here I'll just present some headline statistics and charts showing how numbers of listings have changed over time. My impression is that the picture is actually very similar in Bristol to Manchester in terms of numbers, which I think is interesting for us to reflect on in today's meeting. And then thirdly, I want to talk about the implications of this in terms of housing, but also related to other problems, and how these kind of combine together in making everyday life in Manchester look perhaps different to how it did a few years ago. And then I'll wrap up with just a few comments before I pass on to Mehmet and Claire. So I want to start by noting how strong the narratives about the sharing economy were in academia, in commentary, in business circles. So this idea that we're all familiar with of sharing underused assets, so things like drills and cars, parts of our home that we don't otherwise use. And even this kind of image of hosting that's been so important for Airbnb, staying with someone local and learning about where they live, they come with a lot of kind of interesting assumptions and a certain amount of ideological baggage. And one of the sort of findings of the report for Manchester was that the reality of the industry is quite different to this. And one sign of that we found really interesting was how developed the short-term rental management sector had become in the city. So these are companies who meet guests, they exchange keys, they clean, they arrange bookings, and they use dynamic pricing to list property on multiple sites, not just Airbnb. Obviously, we're mainly talking about Airbnb today, but there are a range of other sites which are sort of important in the market. So there are 4 dedicated property management companies that operate in Manchester, and at least 10 more nationally who claim to be able to offer these services. So it's a sort of surprisingly developed field. The sharing economy narrative was always misleading and associated with sort of the PR materials of the companies. But the growth of these kinds of property management companies suggests that idea of the airbed in the spare room concept has also become progressively less true over time. And we also know that the data internationally support that that picture. So based on different estimates, 59% of listings globally are thought to be commercial listings, only 8% being spare rooms. And in most cities that I've seen where we have data, entire home listings are more numerous than spare rooms. The revenue of the companies mainly and increasingly dependent on professional landlords. And the data that we have on listings in Manchester confirms this impression that short-term rentals are becoming increasingly dominated by commercial listings. So the graph here, thanks to Inside Airbnb for this data, it shows all the listings for Manchester from around 2017 till this year. And a couple of things to point out. The numbers rose from 865 listings in 2016. I think that year is not actually shown on the graph, but that goes up to a peak of 2,820 listings in 2020. The rise of entire home properties has been greater in terms of the kind of percentage increase. That's a 400% increase over 4 years for entire homes. There was a sharp dip during the pandemic, which you can see on the graph. The sort of green section is entire homes. The yellow section represents single rooms. And that also suggests this increasing pattern of dominance by professional landlords, and also suggests that they've recovered from the pandemic much more quickly. So we're back up to 1,362 entire homes in the last month that data was collected. Obviously, we don't know what will happen in the next few years, but if those growth trends continue now at the rate that they were growing but prior to the pandemic, we could be looking at over 5,000 entire properties on the platform by 2026. So in sort of just under kind of 4 years. And that would, we estimated, shut out over 12,000 residents from Manchester, or that would be living long term in Manchester. And it's worth saying that even if this rate didn't continue as rapidly in Manchester, the data show that Airbnb has also been spreading and becoming more distributed across Greater Manchester and residential neighbourhoods. So I want to just zoom in a bit, talk about the effects of these short-term rentals. So for each one of these 1,300 entire home listings, there are wider effects which you can't see from the data alone. So one of the things that we did with the report was we gathered interviews and some written testimonies from people living in the same street as Airbnbs. And these are relatively randomly chosen. What I wanted to show is the anger and frustration that people were feeling. So one city centre resident who lived in the same block of flats as an Airbnb shifts into caps lock in her testimony to say, we're not a hotel. Which I think really captures this kind of sense of people have locally, that there's no recognition still from the council or government. The transformation of a living space into short-term accommodation is a really dramatic change in use that has serious kind of consequences for neighbours. And that's also obvious from these other testimonies, reports of parties, music equipment, noise, and increased rubbish. So there are frustrations around this kind of interconnected set of issues that everyone sort of knows about, around noise, disturbance, pressure on local services, and so on. And the expansion of houses to hold more guests, which in turn sort of augments some of those pressures on local services, for example, and likelihood that there'll be noise problems. At the same time, you have the displacement of long-term residents who would otherwise be working, paying taxes, raising kids in the area. And all this makes it harder and harder to be a neighbour to an Airbnb. And so what I'm sort of trying to convey here is that there are direct pressures on housing of displacing long-term residents, which combine with a set of indirect pressures on the neighbourhoods. And then a kind of effect where people moving out because the area's sort of less attractive to live in are then often replaced by landlords who are buying up nearby properties. And that kind of creates a negative cycle that other authors have talked about. An example of that we found quite striking was in one street in Mosside that we know about. 5 of the last 8 house sales went to a short-term let company. So I want to kind of leave it here more or less, just a few final thoughts. One is that we still need more data and more information about how short-term lettings are affecting cities, but also rural areas in the UK. So there's a suggestion in a lot of journalism that in Wales, Cornwall and the Lake District, it's become very difficult to live there because of the rapid rises in numbers. But we need, I think, better ways of collecting what local residents know and what web scraping tells us. I think we also need to know more, but also perhaps just communicate more widely about the regulation that's been tried elsewhere and the effects of it. So it's communicating about research like that of Claire's, and obviously keeping an eye on Scotland and Wales and what's happening there with their regulation. I think local knowledge, and this was really obvious to me doing the work with Greater Manchester Tenants Union and the residents groups. The local knowledge is really important for actually collecting data and collecting these kind of testimonies. I think it would be interesting to collect more of these nationally and to kind of present a picture of what it looks like to live alongside short-term lets. Obviously, Action on Empty Homes and Greater Manchester Tenants Union have sort of been talking about the current consultation on short-term lets, and this idea the kind of conclusion that we came to in terms of regulation in the report was that councils need powers to be able to refuse conversions of short-term lets to protect housing. It might not be that every council needs to use these powers, but we're aware of a large number who would like them. So I think, yeah, finally, in that kind of consultation, we need to make sure that everybody's participating, because my research and the Uber leaks scandal from this summer reminds us that the companies place a lot of pressure from their side onto governments. So I think just a wider set of voices are needed in the conversation. So that's it. I think the slide's a bit garbled, but I think my email address is on there if people would like to stay in touch. And yeah, thanks everyone for coming, and look forward to your questions.
Okay, thanks very much, Luke. Just want to welcome Councillor Tom Renard, who's joined us, Labour Cabinet Member for Housing, Delivery and Homes. Thanks for coming, Tom. Hopefully you'll be a part of the discussion later on. It's great to see you here. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to ask Claire to give us a European perspective, and I do believe that the UK is still part of Europe, so geographically, if nothing else. So she'll be talking a little bit about that. So over to you, Claire.
Thank you, and thank you to everybody for organising this great roundtable. So it will very nicely build on what Luke just presented, and I'm going to briefly summarise the key findings of a piece of research we did with other colleagues last year that investigated how large cities in Europe are trying to grapple with the phenomenon of short-term rentals and the different tools they are using to regulate it. So I won't go into the details, but I'll try to summarise the headline of how it is done elsewhere and draw lessons for the UK. So we all know that there's a huge amount of debate on the impact of short-term rental on housing markets. I'm not going to talk about this very much, just to say that that debate is very vivid across Europe, although there are huge discussions on how do we actually measure those impacts. And here, it's very important to acknowledge the absolutely amazing support that Inside Airbnb and the Data Activist Project that Murray Cox has launched has played to help a lot of cities, researchers, activists actually have access to data that is helpful to make policy recommendations. And it's great that Murray will be here to talk about it a bit later. So just for the purpose of talking about the regulation, one of the things I wanted to clarify is that we have actually looked at how 3 different types of short-term rentals were regulated across different cities. They are not perfectly watertight different types. There is porosity between them, but they were just useful to distinguish for analytical reasons. There was on the one hand what we could call the commercial professional holiday let, a housing unit that is used the whole year round as a short-term rental. And then we made a distinction between the occasional renting out of a first or second home when the main resident is not using it, and the home sharing in a strict sense, which is the rental of a room in somebody's home when they are actually present and they just rent a room to someone who is visiting. And so what we found, we looked at the following 12 cities. You can see on this slide, we interviewed dozens of policymakers. We had a very close look at the text of the regulations, and we also were able to follow inspectors in charge of implementing the regulations in some cities to see the difficulties they had in enforcing regulations. What we found is that there are very, very different approaches between these cities. Different in terms of the policy domains that are used to regulate. In some cities, it comes from tourism. In others, land use planning. In other cities, it is housing or business licensing, or different forms of local and national taxation that are used to actually try and regulate some aspects of the phenomenon. We also found that there are huge differences in the level of stringency of the new regulation. Some cities have adopted a relatively laissez-faire approach, not seeking to regulate too much the phenomenon. For example, in our sample, Milan, Rome, or Prague. We found that other city governments in Berlin, Barcelona, Amsterdam, and Madrid tried to implement much more stringent restrictions to try and really contain the growth, in particular, of commercial short-term rental, the full units that are withdrawn from the housing market permanently to be rented short-term. But actually, a lot of cities like London or Paris are trying to find what we could call a middle ground approach, trying to not completely prevent the phenomenon, and in particular to allow individual tenants or homeowners to rent a room in their apartment. What we also saw, and this is extremely relevant for the UK, I'll come back to this, is that there are huge tensions between different tiers of governments that have different agendas in that regard. And very often you have a national or a regional government that is quite pro-deregulation, if you want, and relatively neoliberal in its take on short-term rentals, not wanting very strong regulation. And unsurprisingly, local governments across the board tend to be in demand of better powers to regulate, because they're on the front line of dealing with the dissatisfaction of their local resident when it comes to housing affordability or noise or other forms of nuisances that Luke talked about earlier. We try to look at what exactly is being regulated when we talk about regulation, and I don't want to bother you with all the details, but just to try and distinguish between the main tools that have been used. On the one hand, you have cities that have used registration or licensing schemes to try and effectively make short-term rental visible to public authorities. So if you have to register or if you have to have a permission, the local authorities know you exist and they can then decide how to regulate you. Some cities have implemented quality standards with quite high requirement in terms of fire safety, for example, or standards of equipment. A number of cities have experimented with using planning and zoning powers to actually try and influence the geography of short-term rentals. And these are examples of some of the cities that have used different forms of zoning or land use planning regulation to try and either diminish the number of short-term rentals in certain neighborhoods that are considered congested. And this is an approach that's been tested in Vienna and in Lisbon and in Amsterdam, for example, with difficulties. Or in some cases to completely diminish the total number of short-term rental licenses that are available in the city. And this is the approach that's been taken in Barcelona. Other tools that have been used are time limits in terms of number of days per year that are imposed on the occasional rental of somebody's home. And this is used to try and make a distinction between a professional commercial holiday let of an empty home versus an individual tenant or a homeowner, owner-occupier going on holiday a few weeks during the year and renting out their property whilst they're away. And finally, there's three other sets of mechanisms that have been used. I'll briefly come back to this. Taxation, both local taxation and national taxation, is very important to try and influence the extent of the phenomenon. The practices of the platforms themselves, and some governments have been stronger than others in trying to impose certain obligations on platforms. And finally, housing regulations. And this is very important in the UK, for example, in countries that have a big social housing stock. For example, prohibiting the subletting of flats in social housing is an important tool of regulation coming from housing regulation. Now, I just wanted to say a few words about the situation in the United Kingdom. In England, as you know, there's very little regulation outside of London. There's no limit on the number of days a property can be let out short term, and it is really up to each local planning authority to make a judgment whether a particular use amounts to something that would require planning permission to change from permanent housing to short-term rental. This is not a very strong mechanism for the moment. London has a slightly different rule with the so-called 90-day rule that we can talk about a little bit later. It hasn't been super effective so far, and I'll come back to this. Luke mentioned Scotland and Wales, and indeed this is where our attention should turn, because both governments have actually very recently either passed new legislations or proposed to pass new legislation that effectively gives stronger tools to local authorities to control short-term rentals. And in both cases, I won't enter into the details, we could return to this in the discussion. The tools are twofold. On the one hand, giving local authorities the capacity to create a licensing system, making it compulsory for operators of short-term rental, either commercial or occasional, to apply for a license and a registration. And on the other tool that's been given to local authorities is the capacity to establish what in Scotland has been called a short-term lettings control area, the first of which was approved in Edinburgh this summer. That effectively means it's easier for a local authority to refuse planning permission for the conversion of a housing unit into a short-term rental. So these are the two tools, if you want, that are being experimented with in Scotland and probably soon in Wales, and we can return to this in the discussion. But no matter how good or how strong new regulations are, if you don't have the tools to implement them, they are not very effective. And this is one of the key findings of the conversations we had with city leaders across Europe, is that instruments can be very powerful, but they cannot necessarily be implemented very well. And there are three main difficulties. The first one is, how can you regulate or implement a regulation if you don't have access to proper data? And by this, I mean, if you do not know where exactly short-term rentals are located, the address of the property, and the name of who operates a flat. And that issue has been generated by the fact that platforms so far, with few exceptions that Murray will probably talk about and explain in greater depth, have not accepted to supply listings of the properties that they advertise on their website to the public authorities that have asked for them. There are a few exceptions to this that we can discuss, but by and large, this has not been a very widespread practice. So for a local authority, you're trying to regulate a phenomenon without knowing where it is exactly and who is running that particular use. Second, we've heard everywhere, and specifically in the UK, that local authorities have really limited resources, human resources for enforcement. In the UK, local authorities have been decimated by a decade of austerity, and so the staffing in planning departments that are in charge of controlling and inspecting possible illegal uses of housing is very low, making it very difficult to actually, carry out inspections where it might be needed. And thirdly, what we found everywhere is there are very powerful interest groups, and it could be a professional organization of commercial landlords or platforms themselves, that have been very active to mobilize against regulations, as Luke said, and that can be done in multiple ways. But one of the main instruments they've been using is to appeal against local or national regulation in courts, or in the case of EU member states, in front of the European Court of Justice, in some cases leading to the quashing or the suspension of regulations that have actually been taken by cities or regions or national government. So to conclude, we are in a situation where ideally democratically elected local government should decide what is best for their context in terms of regulating short-term rental, and there are obviously difficult political choices to be made between the needs of long-term residents, the demands of visitors and temporary users, and housing as an asset, and housing as a right and as a public good. And here the crucial point is that national and EU frameworks really need to give local authorities the power and ability to regulate short-term rentals and second home. And in the case of the UK, and for the purpose of the current consultation to which many of us are hopefully putting together a response, it means looking at three key areas of action. Planning policy and enforcement, I've already mentioned that, and that really means looking at what's happening in Wales and Scotland and trying to see to what extent similar tools can be set up for England. The second key area of action is platform accountability, effectively pushing the UK government to basically demand from platforms the release of the data that is necessary to actually regulate, and also to ask platforms to be accountable and remove the listings that are illegal. And I think Murray will hopefully talk more about this. And he has produced with Kenneth Haar a wonderful report for the European Parliament that does a forensic analysis of those demands on platforms and what they should do to facilitate the regulatory process. And I will conclude by mentioning a third aspect that is not very often talked about, but that's really key in the English and British context, which is taxation. There's all sorts of tax arrangements that actually make it quite profitable or that act as an incentive for property owners to use their property as short-term rentals. And that includes national taxation, that includes the transaction on the tax on the transaction of property. And more recently, there has been a big debate in Wales in particular about a loophole that was created during the pandemic that effectively encouraged second home owners to convert their property in short-term rental in order to escape council tax and pay a local discounted rate of business tax, the details of which I can't talk about. But there's a whole, if you want, big box of discussion and debates on how taxation, both local taxation and national taxation, can or should be modified to incentivize certain building uses. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Claire. If you could, I'll just remove your slides. Hang on. Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. Thank you for that. Really interesting. Lots of interesting stuff in there to build on the Manchester discussion. Quite like to hand over to Mehmet Kansoy now to give us the view from across the pond. I think is one way of thinking it.
Thank you, Will. If you could put up my slides. Thank you for Luke and Claire's comments. I think what I'm going to say is going to repeat much of what they said, just in the American context. So I'm going to present a set of findings from our recent publication with Juliet Shore, focusing on what we called commercialization. I think it's very much in line with what Luke was calling professionalization. So Luke already mentioned this, but there's this idea that Airbnb is supposed to be about sharing, that if you have a spare room, if you put the air mattress in there and then you rent that out and make some money on the side. And that idea has been fairly broad spread, especially here in the US. Like that's how so many local regulators look at the issue. So we use data from these 10 cities you're seeing on the screen to, first of all, track what's been happening in the market over the last 5-6 years. As you can see, there's a lot of growth in there's been a lot of growth in the Airbnb market. I just showed earlier the number of units up for rent have gone up. The number of nights that they're available to be booked have gone up dramatically. We're talking about a 200% increase over the course of the 2015 to 2020-ish year. So that's a really dramatic increase. And when we look at the revenue they generated, this is, by the way, our best guess at their revenue using a machine learning algorithm. Obviously, Airbnb doesn't release their data, as Claire just mentioned, so we don't really know how much money is being made. But you can still see quite a dramatic increase, basically a 6-fold increase in revenue over the time period we're talking about. So what does it mean that Airbnb is growing like this, but we also have this rhetoric about Airbnb being a spare room, spare beds kind of platform? Well, we tried to divide the market into 4 types of units up for rent. So we created 4 categories: very casual units that are really not being utilized heavily as a rental property. So they would be on the market less than a month and they would be booked maybe 2 weeks or so. Then casual units, they would be available for up to 4 months and they would be booked between a month or less. A month to 2 months. Then frequently rented units, and then very frequently rented units, which are basically both of these categories mean a unit that is fully commercial, that is not used for other users, maybe as a second home in the case of frequently rented units. But again, if you're renting a property out 240 days of the year, that's a rental property, that's not a home. So looking at it this way, what we figured out was, if you looked at just what's available on the platform, not just what makes money or anything like that yet, it does somehow seem like the very casual units do make up a big chunk of the platform, about 40% of the platform starting at the end of 2016. So that seems to kind of vindicate this idea that Airbnb is the spare bed, spare mattress kind of platform. However, when you look at any other metric, that rhetoric falls apart. So, for example, when you look at the annual market roll, how many of these properties are getting booked? So, not just on the platform available to be booked, but how many of them actually generate like at least one reservation during the time they're on the platform? What you can clearly see is about 60% of properties that receive at least one booking are actually very frequently rented properties. And then come the frequently rented ones, and the casual users make up really a small chunk of properties that end up generating a reservation. This becomes even more dramatic when you look at the revenue side of things. So very frequently rented properties make up anywhere between 60 and 70% of the money on the platform at any given point in the year. And again, this has been fairly stable, as you can see, for 5-6 years. So this is not just an artifact of like the platform growing too quickly and not onboarding enough properties or anything like that. This is what the platform generates money for. And again, casual users make up a tiny, tiny sliver of actual revenue generated on the platform. So what does this mean at the end of the day? Well, I think Luke and Claire kind of gave us a preview of this, right? Like, first of all, there are generous, some might say, like really morally objectionable levels of incentives at play for property owners to convert units into long-term, short-term rentals instead of actually allowing people to live in them. Some of my earlier research on this shows like it's the added benefit of converting a unit to a full-term, short-term rental is somewhere between 3 to 10 times the amount of revenue you would generate by having a standard 12-month lease on the property. So the incentives are there to really displace long-term residents. The second thing I wanted to talk about here is something Claire was mentioning, and I'm going to just switch over here. So we looked at a couple of these cities in depth, looking at their regulatory attempts. And what we found out was, like Claire mentioned, there's a whole range of different regulatory action in the US too, from like Austin, where regulation has been relatively light because of conflicts between the state level regulation or regulatory attempts and the city level regulation. And what we're seeing is, like, despite registration requirements and the hotel tax being applied to short-term rentals, in a city like Austin, the commercialization has grown really rapidly. As you can see, the very frequently rented properties have grown dramatically over the period of time that we studied. So this isn't a case where regulation was relatively light and wasn't applied evenly over the course of the period. We then looked at San Francisco. San Francisco is sometimes seen as one of the heavier regulatory regimes in the United States, right? Like there was big pushes for regulation as far back as like 2013. The city did pass a lot of relatively heavy regulation on who can host, how many days a year you can host people, registration requirements, and then mandating that Airbnb display registrations on their website, and some amount of data sharing, though that's very contentious. But what we're seeing is that hasn't really impacted the commercialization part of it. As you can see, again, very frequently rented properties still make up the bulk of properties that are available, and they still tend to make up a large portion of the revenue in the market. Finally, we looked at Seattle. We do look at all 10 cities. These are just a quick snapshot here. And Seattle, Washington shows probably the heaviest regulatory regime in the US. So there's both city regulations, state regulations, and a data sharing mandate in place. Again, though, the impact on commercialization. So can you rein in home sharing, home letting, so that it becomes this like casual thing where people can make money off of a spare room when they have it? doesn't seem very encouraging, right? Like, again, it's a very heavily commercialized market without a lot of, like, even though some of the heavy regulations went into effect during the time we studied, the commercialization doesn't seem to have reduced by much. So what does this mean? I think Claire's points are really well made. The regulatory capacity of local governments is very restricted. I interviewed people in working for New York City. They were basically looking at pictures and trying to figure out if an apartment was south facing, whether it was on the 4th floor or the 5th floor. That's just not a sustainable practice when you have like 80,000 properties across the city doing short-term rentals. I think what's going to change, if anything can change in this field, is enforcing data sharing. Airbnb fights data sharing agreements very vigorously. It takes years of litigation, millions of dollars to litigate here in the United States. So a way of getting data sharing in place so that local governments get actionable data out of the platform is probably the only way to meaningfully regulate this practice. I'm looking forward to talking more about this. I've been studying this stuff for about a decade now, so looking forward to the conversation later.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much, Mehmet. That's really interesting as well. You can see a picture developing here of quite a large organisation that seems to be able to outmaneuver local governments to a great deal, and that's something we need to think about. So what I want to do now is I want to bring in Murray to give us his first reflections on what he's heard today and his general thoughts about the issue. So if I can hand over to you, Murray, that'd be great.
Great, thank you, everyone. And it's been really interesting to hear everyone's opinions. I haven't prepared any slides because I was really asked to respond and maybe fill in gaps based on what I've heard or what I think what I could add to the conversation. But I just wanted to just introduce myself again. My name's Murray Cox. I'm the founder of Inside Airbnb, a data activist project. Been collecting data since 2015, and I also am involved in research. I talk to a lot of cities and activists. I talk to cities about how the impacts of short-term rentals, regulations, enforcement, compliance. I also provide data to some of those cities, or many of those cities, sometimes directly. That those cities are using my data for enforcement. But I just wanted to just focus in on Bristol for a second. On my website, if anyone wants to go to insideairbnb.com/Bristol, I've been collecting data for Bristol for a number of years. There's currently about 2,000 Airbnb listings in Bristol. About 2/3 of them are entire homes and apartments. What I also focus on a lot in my analysis are property portfolios of Airbnbs. I don't think many of our speakers mentioned that in detail, but in Bristol, about half of the entire homes or apartments are in a property portfolio where the host has more than one Airbnb. There's even an operator that has 154 entire homes or apartments in Bristol. There's another operator that has 61. And so I think that's really something that exists as we combine the housing market with the tourism market. I would say that's not something that we should have done or that we should do. I think that's one of the problems. As I look at some broader data, for example, in the US, I collect data across the entire country. There's more than 1 million listings in the US. There's about 60% of them, of the entire homes, are in a property portfolio. The top 1% of hosts, there's about that makes up about 4,000 hosts. They control 300,000 entire homes and apartments across the country. And so there's a inbuilt incentive as we kind of think about the property market and these property entrepreneurs and speculators trying to figure out how to make money from the real estate market. I would put these Airbnb entrepreneurs in the same category. And sometimes they're just not single entrepreneurs, they're companies, investors, venture capital backed companies. My project started in New York City in 2015. I was living in Brooklyn at the time. When I first started collecting data in the city, there was probably about 20,000 listings. And then fast forward to 2019, just before the pandemic, the number had risen to about 50,000. And I think, as Mehmet mentioned, I think he mentioned he had spoken to officials in the city that they're finding it very difficult to enforce regulations. I've been working with activists in New York City, and going back to about 2018, we had proposed some very solid regulations, which were passed into law in January of this year, and they go into effect next year. And they address some of the challenges of short-term rentals, and I would think of them as a model. But they've got a registration system, which I think many of our speakers have spoken about. But they've also got platform accountability. So many cities introduce registration systems, but it's very common for hosts and also for the platforms to ignore the registration systems. Very often compliance levels will be 10 or 20%. So 80% illegal listings, and we see that in places like Paris and Berlin, and Mehmet mentioned Austin as well, where very few people are getting the required licenses. So in New York City, there'll be a registration system, but the platforms won't be able to accept money from any of the hosts if they're unregistered. And there's a lot of checks to make sure that the registration system, the registration matches the address of the listing and the legal name of the host. And that's really based on the experience of a lot of other cities where there's the platforms really just don't know the identity of the host. And so I think that's another problem where they might use fake names or fake addresses. New York City's laws also include data sharing, and I'll talk about data sharing in a second. And so that's something that we're really looking forward to in New York City. And we've seen the numbers drop because of COVID in New York City, but there's also been some aspects of the numbers dropping because of the expected regulations or regulations that went into effect over the last few years. For example, there was a data sharing law that was litigated, and the city was able to settle with Airbnb, but the regulations were largely in effect. And as a result of that regulation, where the behavior of hosts would have been exposed to the city, many hosts didn't agree to share their data, and therefore they're not able to short-term rent in the city. So talking about data for a second, as many of the speakers mentioned, data is critical. I wish it wasn't as critical. I wish there wouldn't be a need for projects like my own. There are also commercial operators, commercial data providers that are filling the market, both to help hosts make money, and they offer the type of, in their marketing, where can you buy an Airbnb to make the most money? But there are also these other operators that are providing compliance data to cities. And so in the US, where many cities are adopting registration systems, they're also signing up with companies like Host Compliance in the US to help the city understand their compliance rates. These companies also implement registration systems or complaint systems and integrate with the city's IT systems. But it's been, although we all talk about data being hard to get, jurisdictions have been able to regulate for the supply of data. Probably one of the biggest supply of data is the in France where there were national laws for the provision of data, and that's been in effect for a couple of years. And although the data is difficult to really control the situation, but there are some precedents for provision of data both for tax compliance, but also regulatory compliance against the housing law. Yeah, I don't think I'll continue on that much. I'm really looking forward to maybe participating in the roundtable. Some of my own plans for the data are, I'm collecting data across the entire UK. I've started making it available to journalists, and you can see people from The Guardian starting to write articles about use in different cities, even in regional areas. But I'm hoping to be able to provide data for any city or town in the UK soon, and so that's something that I'm working on, but also focusing on impact on housing and also this commercial nature, which we've been talking about. Yeah.
Well, thanks for that, Murray. That's really interesting. We've got a never-ending list of people contacting us from around the country saying they've got a problem with Airbnb and short lets, and it's definitely something that is getting really high on the public agenda. I'm just thinking in terms of Bristol, Tom. How does the data picture look from where you are? Because people are saying the data is the most difficult thing.
Yeah, I mean, I've just been having a good look through the inside Airbnb data with interest, and I'll be continuing to dissect that afterwards, because I think that's the most helpful picture I've seen to date of the problems in Bristol. And it's probably just worth me touching on a bit of the context for us in Bristol as well. Our social housing waiting list has over 18,500 households on it now. We've got nearly 1,200 households in temporary accommodation in the city. We've got huge challenges around private rented sector more broadly, both in terms of availability of private rented accommodation, but also its affordability. And we've launched a living rent commission that's looking at that question of affordability. What is affordable? What is affordable? In terms of renting, but also then what do we want to see a living rent look like for Bristol? And what's been interesting is some of the early data we've started to look at, because we're working with the University of Bristol on it, is seeing also a reduction in the availability of private rented sector stock, and prices rising fastest within that, the more affordable end of the private rented sector market. That's where we're seeing like the quickest jumps in prices. So it's a bit of a glum picture, and then of course you have this issue around short-term lets. And for us, what's quite frustrating is how few powers we have to regulate it, being outside London. I've been following what's been happening in Scotland with interest. I know there's currently a government consultation that's just looking at the short-term let sector, which closes next week. So I think for those of you that are watching online, do encourage your local authorities to make sure they respond to that consultation, because it's a kind of a far reach one, looking at opportunities as well as the challenges. I don't only tend to see challenges given the pressures there are on our stocks. So data is really key for us. The ability to license and regulate is something we're really keen to see as well. We have introduced licensing schemes more broadly for private rented sector stock, and we're currently looking at citywide schemes and whether that's something that we can take forward. And I also note, of course, in the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill, depending on what happens with that, given the change of leadership, around some of the additional powers in there in terms of that 100% premium that could be applied to empty homes, in terms of bringing it forward for charging from after a year, I think it is, rather than the 2 years. And then the other part that's around for sort of second homes, that premium, which will be helpful. But I guess the question is, will that actually address, or will that just then be reflecting an increase in price of the listings in terms of them absorbing the cost? So data's crucial. We need, for me, from a local government perspective, it's about having more powers for us to be able to really challenge this. And I know colleagues from across the southwest would agree, and particularly Devon and Cornwall have got their own campaign down there, first homes not second homes, because they're really kind of seeing the impact in an even more magnified way.
It's interesting, Tom, as you were talking, I got a question. There's people putting questions in now, and almost immediately the question came up saying, are we already fully and effectively using the powers available to us in Bristol, or is there room for improvement? So are you doing what you can, do you think?
So,
Is there stuff you'd like to do that you're not using, or?
So we closed the loopholes a few years ago around council tax discounts for empty unfurnished properties, and we do enact the once they've been empty for 2 years, once they've been empty for 5 years, and is it 10 years, I think, to go to the maximum kind of council tax increase. And we do a lot of work around trying to encourage landlords to bring properties back into use on the sort of the empty property side, recognizing that, I mean, we could obviously go down to the CPO route. But it's important to remember that when you're trying to go down a CPO route to deal with empty properties, it's quite a resource intensive route. I know it's something they're looking at, I think, through the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill. And it's then kind of that effort and resource when you're a local authority that's been cut to the bone in all your functions, being able to then see those things through can be really challenging. I always welcome that challenge though. If there's someone going, well, hang on, you've got this power and you're not really using that as to the extent you could, then it's a really welcome challenge from my perspective.
Okay, and I'd just like to bring in Matty. The Bristol Cable's doing work on housing. What does it make of the issue in terms of Airbnb and short lets in Bristol?
Yeah, I mean, actually, I would only really be echoing what Murray said. We did some reporting that we scraped some data from Rightmove listings, which showed that there was an increasing number of short-term lets being advertised on those kind of platforms, as well as the trends that Murray mentioned using the inside Airbnb data. And we've seen sort of anecdotal evidence of quite experienced residential landlords who typically would be renting out HMOs in the city. It appears like there's a kind of shift towards these short-term rentals at obviously inflated prices. So that's something that we've seen on a kind of anecdotal level so far in Bristol. But yeah, I feel like we need a lot more research to actually show that more clearly and kind of get into the weeds of these different trends.
Okay. I put on the ticker below, you can see the link to the government short-term lets consultation document. If you go to our website, if you're watching, you'll be able to find it there. I do encourage people to fill that in. We've made it a 2-minute job or a much longer job. So do go to our website and do fill it in. You've got till the 21st to do that. It's really, really important. In terms of regulation, in terms of kind of getting a grip on the process, what do people think the most effective? I mean, there's been a lot of talk about data, and I understand that. Yeah, a lot of talk about data. Different jurisdictions allows different kinds of data to be available. But let's just think about what do people think would be the most effective form of regulation of Airbnb? What do they think would work across the piece? What's the number one thing that you would do if you were asked, policymaker?
Could I say something?
Yeah, sure.
So first, I think we need to perhaps distinguish between regulating the platforms. And so when we say regulate Airbnb, it's actually not very precise. We need to distinguish regulating the platform and regulating the people who do short-term rentals, because they are very different things and they require very different levels of intervention. Regulating the platform needs action at national level or EU level. There's no way you can, convince them to release data. And as Murray said, one of the few countries that has managed to get them to release the data in some cities is by passing a national law, which is France. The Greek government has also managed to sign an agreement for data sharing with their tax office. And so national government seems to be the minimum scale that managed to get somewhere. And there is also a coalition of more than 20 mayors at European level that are now trying to put pressure on the European Commission to convince platforms to do that. So that tier of action is probably the right one to deal with platforms. When we talk about regulating short-term rental, in the case of the UK and England, because England is so centralized, pressure needs to be put on central government to give the local authorities the means to actually decide how they want to regulate. And that's exactly what the Welsh and the Scottish Parliament have done. So England is in a quite specific situation of a very centralizing nation where there's not much leeway for local authorities in the current context unless central government actually gives them the tools through a register, through a licensing scheme, through the power to then refuse planning permission for certain uses. And there are some tools that currently exist. So, for example, some local councils have experimented with attaching conditions to new developments. And I think St. Ives has tried this, and it's just been voted in Brighton, to basically make it a condition that any new built home cannot be used as a second home or as a short-term let, but you can only do this with new built developments. And a lot of the people who actually want to convert a property into a short-term rental actually will use an existing old historical property with a lot of charm and, you know, in demand with tourists. So there are some tools that currently exist, but they are perhaps not sharp enough in England, in the current state of the powers that are there in the hands of local authorities, to attempt at regulating in ways that are desirable for a local community and their councillors.
Right. Okay. So do you think that then that offers the possibility of a councils allying with local populations and then campaigning together, and then councils allying with other councils? I mean, Tom, is that going on? Are councils discussing with each other about how to deal with this phenomena, and is there any action from them expected?
I think some are talking to each other. I think one of the things for me is think about the local government association and the role that they can play as the national body for councillors within sort of the UK. So I think for us, you know, if I'm thinking about sort of tactically, what Scotland have done is they've mandated all local authorities have got to introduce a scheme. And I think England, under the current government, going that direction is highly unlikely. But where I think we may be able to go is ensuring that those powers are released to local government to enact them, a bit like what we have with licensing in the private rented sector at the moment in the case of additional licensing. Selected licensing, for those not so familiar with it, if you want to go over 20% of the eligible properties, you have to go back to Secretary of State for permission to then bring that scheme in. So, you know, I'd always advocate for local government being able to have the tools at its disposal to then apply those things for its relevant to its situation. I think that's also a more likely route, given there is at least more of a focus on devolution as well at the moment. So those would be some of the things. I think having the ability to introduce registration schemes would be something we'd be really keen on, certainly in Bristol, to make sure we've got a grip of the issue, as well as exercising any powers that may come in through the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill, which are currently, well, in trainers and hopefully staying in train. So those would be some of the key things for me. I think the planning one is quite an interesting one, and certainly one I'll be taking away because we're in the middle of a refresh of our local plan, which is nearly a decade old. So there could be an opportunity there. And also I think there's something for me, just while I'm on my kind of Christmas wish list, for looking at what I think is happening in Kensington and Chelsea, where I think they've entered into a partnership, haven't they, with Airbnb to get the data on social housing, which was referred to earlier, to see if there's any being let out through Airbnb, because we would want access to that data to be able to crack down on it. I think they've had to go through a court route, is my understanding. I think that it's been something that's been mandated through a court judgment to get around kind of like some of the GDPR issues. But you know, I think that's just something that should just be in place and should have to happen. And all data should be being shared with local authorities, particularly with the pressures on our social housing stock, as I outlined earlier. And you know, a Bristol situation is certainly not unique. London boroughs would share some of the challenges they've got in similar situations, and as have most cities, you know, growing waiting lists for social housing. So for the sort of small amount of social housing that we do have, whether it's council stock, whether it's arms length management organisations, whether it's housing associations and registered providers, we'd want to make sure we're cracking down to ensure that the people that need that housing are the ones getting it.
Okay, I've got some questions coming in now about activism. So somebody said we've had a lot of discussion here about how local authorities and governments can take action, but how about activists and campaigners? Are there examples from around the world where people have campaigned and pushed local government and governments into doing stuff? And if so, what are they? Looking to our international guests with international knowledge here. Claire, Mehmet. Well, Luke, this must be actually in Manchester as well. So Mehmet, how about you? Let's come in first.
I can get us started, but my research isn't specifically on this, so I will welcome other contributions as well. So San Francisco comes to mind as perhaps the biggest showcase for this. So there was a huge mobilization in San Francisco against this, because I hope people know San Francisco is in a huge housing crisis because they've refused to build any houses for the last 70 years in the city. So the housing price was already displacing people, and then the rapid growth of Airbnb over the last decade has meant like tens of thousands of people were being pushed out of otherwise long-term rental units. However, the thing is, San Francisco's activism wasn't very successful. So they pushed for a citywide Proposition F in 2014. But like Luke was mentioning, Airbnb engaged in an AstroTurf campaign opposing it and managed to overturn it. So Airbnb's the ability to mobilize users and spend money on that mobilization has trumped the local mobilization in San Francisco. Now, Murray mentioned he's been working with activists in New York, and they have been much more successful. So maybe he would like to talk a little bit more about that. But the bigger issue is in smaller cities, smaller towns, that's been much harder. Again, because of the like disproportionate resources Airbnb can sometimes bring to bear. Doesn't mean it's been completely unsuccessful. I know a couple of successes in like small vacation towns in upstate New York, for example, but it's been rarer in my experience. And I'll let other people talk.
Any other examples of activism?
Yeah, if I can, I might talk about it. And part of my role is providing data to activists as they build campaigns, activists and residents in different cities. Right now there's a set of activists in Dallas, Texas, but there's also a statewide coalition where they're helping other residents in other cities fight for regulations. Most activists work on a strategy of educating the public, lobbying their elected officials. And so the data really provides good evidence of both impacts, the commercial nature of Airbnb. Sometimes residents and activists focus on the housing issue. Sometimes they focus on quality of life issues or the disruption of their residential neighborhoods. So I think it's kind of important to think that through. One of my frustrations is that, and I think we already talked about it just now, about what if there needs to be more regional or national activism. And I think most people that are affected by the issue are at the local level. They usually got power only at the local level. They're vying against very well-funded lobbying, sometimes at the national level. And so that's very challenging. And so I think thinking through how we can build coalitions of both local activists and then people with affordable housing who are doing the affordable housing work, I think that's something that's very important. There are a lot of informal networks. There are networks in Southeast Europe that are coordinating some of these attempts. There's even activism amongst the cities. For example, there are a group of 20 plus European cities that have been lobbying the European Commission for regulations. So I think that's something that we should think about in terms of activism as well. But I think we have to understand that some of the campaigns that Mehmet mentioned, the short-term rental platforms in San Francisco spent $10 million to fight the citizens' referendum. And in New York City, they spent $10 million on multiple campaigns to fight for regulation. So there's a movement, there's organizing amongst the hosts to protect their economic interests. And there's a lot of lobbying amongst the platforms to also protect their economic interests. I'm happy to work with any local activists or to help build up those campaigns by providing data and also expertise. So that's, yeah, I just wanted to add that.
Okay, that's really interesting. Claire?
Yeah, just to add a few examples from Europe. So in the 12 cities we've looked at, the cities where there was the most visible activist networks were Barcelona, Berlin, and to a lesser extent some nascent movements in Madrid and Lisbon. And it is not entirely surprising in the sense that these cities already had pre-existing extremely active social movements in the field of housing, in the field of anti-eviction. So they didn't come out of nowhere, and there's usually a relationship between the existing ecosystem of social movement on housing issues in particular, but not only. So that was an important factor. The visibility of the phenomenon in very dense Southern European cities where it's really in your face and some neighborhoods have been rapidly transformed was an important factor. But we can see that they were most effective in influencing local policy simply when there was a political window of opportunity and a sympathetic local government coming into power. So in Barcelona, those movements did have an impact in influencing the policy agenda and encouraging the local government to take stricter regulation. But because a new progressive city government was elected in 2015 and was prepared to listen to them. And so you have other cities where these movements are there, but the political agenda of the local government might not be necessarily very sympathetic. And this is where, as Murray said, coalitions between different movements across different cities might be important, because then they can start also trying to lobby the regional and the national scale, which sometimes are important to then set the framework for what's happening at the local level. So that's definitely an important thing to think about. And the other thing I wanted to mention about these movements that came strongly when we were talking to activists is also the daily communication work and pedagogical work that individual activists and residents need to do with the people around us. I mean, I'm sure many of you, the number of times many of you will have had conversation with family and friends about Airbnb or Uber or other platforms. A lot of well-meaning people with, progressive political credential do not realize the type of impacts we're talking about unless we explain to them what's going on. And how many times I've had a discussion with friends saying, oh, I'm just going to rent an Airbnb on my holiday. And I said, did you check it's a licensed, or legal apartment? Have you thought about what it does to local community? And so a lot of the activists were also telling us that there's sometimes a big job to do on a street level, talking to neighbors, to friends, and to family, to explain what are the implications of our very digital practices that are so convenient that we don't think about their impact. And that could be in terms of food deliveries. I'm thinking about the whole discussion on dark kitchens, which is emerging also in cities, another aspect of the transformation. And that is not necessarily easy because people are used to convenient, 1-minute reservations through apps. In Barcelona, there was a huge argument that for a lot of people struggling after the 2008 crisis, renting their flat on Airbnb or part thereof was an important part of sustaining their income. And that's an argument you hear in London, you hear in expensive cities. And to be fair, this is obviously an argument that's used by platform to justify their existence. But you do hear it in public meetings and in community meetings. You do hear some people who say, I do use Airbnb as a way to pay my rent or pay my mortgage, and you can't completely ignore those voices. So that created tensions within movements on how they were dealing with their own immediate friends and neighbors who perhaps were engaged in those practices. So I think these are perhaps slightly more complicated issues that activists have to navigate in their daily conversations with others in their neighborhoods.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting because we had a question in earlier that said, how can we best frame the conversation about Airbnb to the public who see it as an affordable travel option? I'd be interested in the views of the panel on what do we think the best messaging is on this? Because I had that experience with a relative of mine who said, oh, you're not campaigning against Airbnb, are you? Because that's the only way my friend actually survives in the city. Yeah. So there's those issues, quite, completely understandably. So what are the best messages? What's the best way of framing a kind of a policy option to contain the rise of Airbnb and short lets, do people think? People always go on about positive messaging. What are the positive messages? Luke?
I'll just come in on it's kind of actually a bit of a continuation of the previous discussion, but perhaps I'll evolve into answering that too. Yeah, it just I wanted to talk a little bit about how things have changed in the last few years, how the discourse has changed around Airbnb and I think that those changes have come about because of activists and because of housing movements largely. It's worth saying that the kind of hundreds of front groups that Airbnb did set up to try and protect its advantages in these cities were set up in the greatest numbers where there was a strong housing movement. So they were attempts to neutralize something which had already begun to change the conversation and had convinced city authorities to start bringing in legislation. And obviously there were some successes of that sort of astroturfing strategy by Airbnb, but also with that strategy now, a lot more people know about it. It's becoming discredited in a lot of contexts. People know that the kind of relationships that the company has with the groups of hosts, and that takes away their power. So there's a story really of the increasing sort of the increasing impact of social movements, particularly around housing, and attempts to counter that by the platforms that is becoming less effective. So it doesn't really. I didn't really get onto your question, Will. But
no, it's like very interesting though. But that's okay. Do you want to add on in terms of what are the key themes, or do you want to leave it there?
I'll leave it there. Come back. Yeah.
Okay, that's all right. We've had a comment in which it says there certainly needs to be greater awareness among tourists that the types of holiday they choose can fund depriving neighbourhoods of homes and destroying stable communities. Some typos in it, but never mind. So I think we get the point there that tourists need to be made aware of what they're doing and what they're engaged in. I mean, we've also had another comment in saying, well, I'll get to that comment because I wanted to ask Tom a question and Matty a question. Actually, I'll start with Matty. How strong is the housing movement in Bristol? How much astroturfing will Airbnb have to do if the campaign takes off?
I don't actually know what astroturfing means.
Do you want to?
So basically, it's putting together a community organization that's actually funded and organized by the company itself. So Airbnb in this case. So it looks like grassroots, but it's not actual grass. That's the analogy.
I've always wondered. I thought that's what it meant. So is the housing movement strong in Bristol, Matty?
Yeah, absolutely. There's lots of different groups in the city. Last year, there was a renter-led campaign for reforming the private rental sector that engaged quite closely with Tom and the mayor. So it definitely feels like there's a lot of potential energy there to be harnessed with some kind of local campaign potentially. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and Tom, is that what's your view? Do you feel under pressure as an elected official, or do you welcome the pressure because it strengthens your arm?
I always feel under pressure, and absolutely I do welcome it because it does strengthen. It strengthens our arm. It also strengthens just making sure that we know, because we have our own kind of routes to gather intelligence. But housing campaign organisations will often be on the ground, know really what's going on, and can help inform us on the kind of focused action we need to take. Which has seen us take quite strong sort of stances on private rented sector and enforcement. We're probably one of the more regular users of the banning order powers, but we've only issued 3, but that's quite a lot for a local authority, given that it's not been that well used nationally. So it's helpful, but I think that local pressure, which can help in terms of write to national government on X, Y, and Z issues. Ultimately, that local pressure can bear most when I've got the powers, or the local government has got the powers to implement things, and is either choosing not to do so for what could be a litany of reasons. It can be really effective, but I need the powers in the first place, and that's where kind of national movements are really important, really crucial, as well as them pushing people to come together and collaborate through. Say, as I mentioned, LGA is a good route for us as councillors to be having conversations through and having those policy discussions. Yeah, I think it's probably a slightly longer answer you're expecting. Pressure welcome, but then let's make sure that that if I'm going to have pressure applied to me, that I've got the tools then to implement things. Because sometimes what will happen as a local government official will get all the blame for things that we would say are probably national problems that we're really struggling to deal with.
Yeah. Okay. So any other messages we want to get across the project? Any other methods that have been used? Claire, you put some in the chat. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
No, it was just an example to respond to the discussion about raising awareness of tourists themselves. And so in the 12 cities we looked at, the city of Barcelona is the only one that tried to do this through a communication campaign that happened twice, with posters being put on the wall, and they've now set up this online tool in multiple languages, inviting you as a tourist to check that the flat that you're renting on Airbnb or whatever other platform actually has a license. And very few people know about it, but I've certainly sent it to friends or people who've asked me about, and that's one particular tool. This being said, there are also some interesting debate within social movements about the extent to which individual tourists should be singled out and blamed for their practices, because there's also a lot of very hostile anti-tourist graffitis that have appeared in a number of European cities, and there are intense discussion within movements on whether this is the right strategy to actually make individual tourists feel unwelcome or address and through an attempt to raise their consciousness about their practices, or whether targeting key corporate actors and state authorities is a better strategy. So I think there's a discussion to be had there.
Okay. One person's just commented saying, should we just call on tourists not to use Airbnb? Is that going to help? Should we run a campaign like that? I'm feeding questions through from the public here.
Just coming on that, Will, this kind of question of ethical consumer, the ethical tourist, or something. I think it's worthwhile to a certain point. So in the sense that it helps initiate the kinds of conversations that Claire's talking about what Airbnb really is, what it looks like in the cities that we're staying in, the organizations like Ethical Consumer, who co-published the report that I did on Airbnb's political lobbying, are interested in trying to kind of reframe kind of tourism in these terms. There is the Fair B&B project, which I think also is useful, mainly actually to open up discussion in this way. But I've got some reservations about whether a boycott would work. I think it's more a kind of information raising kind of power that it has, calling a boycott.
Okay. Any other thoughts on that? That's okay if there aren't. Okay. And Chris, you put a comment in. Do you want to bring it in here about?
Well, I was just thinking about this pressure for local regulation and national regulation, essentially, which Tom was talking about. I do think it's interesting that since the end of the 17-18 tax year, although it was introduced prior to, subsequently in 2019, Airbnb have been sharing data on host income with UK tax authorities. I think this is an interesting pressure point with the new powers that are coming in on second home taxation and verification of whether things are businesses or not. It's increasingly to say they won't information with local government when they are in effect sharing it with the taxation arm of national government.
Okay, that's quite interesting. And what do people think would be the most impactful? One final question: what do people think would be the most impactful regulatory power that councils could ask for? I think I went around that one before, but I haven't had the discussion. What's for everybody at the panel? What do they think the most impactful regulatory power would be? Offers.
Well, I would offer change of use.
Change of use. Okay.
Yeah, the planning regulations that the Welsh are introducing, I think, are interesting. I mean, we've been sort of arguing for that kind of regulation.
I can see Luke nodding on that one. Does everybody agree with that? Change of use is the killer blow.
Yeah, I would also just say that change of use is just one thing, but expecting someone to apply for change of use is another challenge. And so, and I think like in Ireland, for example, they have a change of use, but just no one applies for it. And so I think, so you should be thinking about that, like how would you enforce a change of use? And so I think you can really combine the idea of planning or change of use with a registration system. And the registration system could just be proof that you have applied for change of use, and that you're allowed to operate this kind of commercial business in a residential zone. And so I think the ideal scenario is that everyone gets a registration number, whether they're a bed and breakfast, a hotel, or someone that's applied for a change of use, and then allowing the planners in the city, work with the community to define appropriate zoning. But I think change of use needs to be thought of in the context of how you would enforce that type of tool.
There is always a difference between having a law and implementing it and making sure it's enforced.
Yeah.
Go, Tom. You're on mute, Tom. Okay. Oh no, you're still on mute, which is a real shame. Never mind. That's a real shame. I mean, I was looking at the government consultation that they're putting out, and there's lots of stuff there about health and safety in the properties. But we know that what's happened in terms of the health and safety exec and local authorities is a really big. I think Tom's had to leave us. I think he's had a tech problem. There's been really big cuts to those systems. So actually, enforcing regulation is really, really difficult unless local authorities are given the powers to do it.
Yeah, you need an income stream. I think you definitely need an income stream.
You need an income stream to do it. And it's a shame that Tom's gone, because our final question was to him, but he can't answer it. So I'm gonna leave it out. I mean, the question was just asking about the West of England Combined Authority, and are they going to be taking action on this? But I think that's a technical one. I think, Tom, and I think I won't push you on that one.
Oh, Tom's back in backstage. He says.
All right, I'm going to ask him then. Let's have a look.
He's come back in. He's come back in after the tech.
Hi, Tom.
Tom? Sorry about that.
Don't worry, Tom. I was about to say the final question is let's come in for you, actually, which was about the. Let me get it up again because I thought you disappeared. It says this isn't just an issue in Bristol. Is the West of England Combined Authority taking any action on this? What role could they have?
I think there's further questions probably to be had around what WECA or West of England Combined Authority is in a position to do, because we're no longer proceeding with a spatial development strategy, which would have been an overarching strategic spatial framework. We're going back to 3 local plans that all need to talk to each other and cooperate with each other. So I think any route that we can use to influence is really crucial. And if I could just quickly go back to that last thing, that the reason I really sort of agree with Murray is that if you look at how licensing interacts with the planning system, when you're considering, so we've got a supplementary planning document that looks at regulation of housing multiple occupation and around kind of density thresholds within given areas, but we can only use licensed HMOs. When we're considering new applications in the planning system. We can't use, we might know there's, I don't know, 50% density, but if we haven't got licensing in place, which is partly why we're now sort of looking for further, more expansive licensing, is to make sure we're able to use the powers coupled with the licensing schemes to make sure we can use those powers effectively. So I think that needs to be thought about in terms of whatever's going to be done around regulation of the short-term let sector. If you're planning powers, then make sure there's not a load of loopholes or things that then stop local authorities from being able to enact them.
Yeah. Really interesting. One final comment we've had is somebody said we should allow councils to refuse licenses without planning permission, make it illegal to operate without a license. Is one comment, and see nods there, and Rye smiles. Maybe that's one way of doing it. All right, we've run out of time, sadly. That's been absolutely fascinating. I want to thank you all. It's been really interesting, and we'll be sharing this video with people in Bristol, and by the sounds of it, in Brighton and wherever we people want to kind of take action around short lets and Airbnb. So all of you who've taken part on the round table, thank you. Thanks to the people who are watching and asking really interesting questions. But most of all, I want to thank Lily Halliday and Rihanna Pruitt, who you can't see, but who, without their efforts, this event would never have been brought together. And they did a fantastic job, and I'd like to thank them for that. Fill in the government consultation before the 21st. Let them know what you think. We've had lots of people approaching us and doing that, so that's really, really good. We know there are many academics who are putting in evidence to the government consultation, which is also excellent. Let's hope it has some impact. So what I'll do now is I'll say thanks for your attendance, thanks for your contribution, thanks for your questions, and see you all soon. Okay, bye-bye.